This is a first collaboration between Kansas Studies Institute, the CoLab, where we are, if you've not been here before, this wonderful facility, their masterclass series, and the Nerman with their Kansas Focus Gallery. So thank you for coming to see this collaboration. If you are a student and this needs to be documented for any reason, talk to me at the end. All right, so let me introduce Wilbur. Wilbur was born in Kansas City, Missouri a few years ago, and he's lived and worked in Mission for a few more years. He was, for over 40 years, a professor at the Kansas City Art Institute in painting, and he is well known for his cityscapes and landscapes, which we're going to be talking about today. And if you walk over to the Nerman Museum, which some of us are going to do after this, you will see his work on display in the Kansas Focus Gallery. And I checked with Bruce, and one of those pieces, the prominently placed one when you walk into that gallery, is also part of the permanent Nerman collection. So we are going to be able to celebrate Wilbur's work long term. And we also want to thank Jerry, his wife of over 70 years, for joining us today too. So thank you, Jerry and Wilbur, and let's learn about Wilbur's art.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. First, I would like to say that I've been treated so well out here from the beginning, from the time that Bruce and I sat down and decided to have this show here, and had a nice lunch today, and had never seen this part of the campus. I'm really impressed. Yeah, it's really, everything has been, and the way the show was put together and hung, distributed. I was telling Art, I couldn't have done it probably as well, but I probably, it was just hung beautifully, I think. So I feel very privileged to be here and to have a chance to share some thoughts about, not just my painting, but maybe some thoughts about painting generally. And of course, as I understand, I'm only to talk maybe 20 minutes or so, and then I'm going to get questions, right? And I hope I get a number of questions, so you might be thinking of. But this says, as you know, is a watercolor show. It's a watercolor. I'll just say something generally about watercolor, my opinion. Watercolor was always seemed a very natural media for me. My early days, my first day of teaching at the Art Institute was watercolor. And it just seemed quite natural. And in fact, I would say I had to adapt my oil painting to my watercolor in a way, the way I approached it. But I do consider them both just painting medium. The watercolor in this country particularly became such an isolated thing. That is, there were watercolorists and there were painters, and I never thought that was right in the first place. And the Academy, the National Academy, where I am a member too, but that they even had, when I first was elected to the Academy, a separate category for watercolor. And then they began to bring it into painting as one, and now it's more inclusive, because I was thinking the other day that watercolor would really be, in the one sense, water-based media, would be older, much older than oil. I mean, it goes back to the Egyptians, to anything that's on a plaster, the plaster walls. But anyway, yes, this is me. Yeah. I always look at the photograph and wonder, why do I have well, this isn't quite so bad, bent legs, but and now, more recently, I'm using a pad. That shows my age. Of course, I'm standing on concrete. This is done also in watercolor. I have two, naturally, an easel for watercolor and drawing, and then an easel for oil. And I paint most of the time in oil. But when Bruce asked me to have this show, and I was very happy to have it, I really devoted that whole year and another year to just watercolor. And I really was happy that it happened, because I feel I did learn. To me, that's what it's about. In other words, to me, watercolor and oil in the idea, in the concept, is one thing. And for me, it's paint what you see. That's what I'm about. It's just painting what you see. And what we see, essentially, is color. That's all we see. We don't see space. We don't see anatomy. We see sensations of color. So that's where I am beginning. And this is the Cambridge Circle on the top, has this rock wall. And I had painted there years ago, and I loved that whole formation. And then found out that it was sheared off and another building put in. I said, I'll never paint there again, because I'm right there by I don't need to give all these details, but I will, right there by the huge parking lot where the trucks would come in this particular thing. They'd have one truck after another, huge trucks. And they allowed me to paint right on the edge of that carpet. And but when I work in watercolor, of course, I work differently than I do in oil. I work on an inclined space and keep the palette simple. These are things just as in oil. And oh yeah. Okay. Well, this doesn't come out quite as bright as it should, or as dark. I should. That's another thing I should say about me. My approach to watercolor. My approach to watercolor is don't let the medium control you, and don't be afraid of it. In other words, paint it. Naturally, you're going to paint from light into dark, I would say, generally. And don't be afraid of making a mark and not being able to change. Whatever you have to do to the idea that you're after, you do. In other words, if I'm painting and I see that I need a correction, I'm going to make that correction. Now, maybe in time I learned also to use a razor blade to scrape out a little, or of course a brush and water. But the painting, which I hope you'll see right after this. But these were done. Now this is a view. One of my spots has always been up on the Quality Hill at the end of 10th Street, overlooking the bottoms and the river. But this one is one that I painted. I also paint from the same motif over and over again. In other words, I've painted up there for probably 30 years. This one is hard, particularly in watercolor, where I'm facing straight on, because the ending is a wall, and it curves, but you see it as curved. You're not conscious of it. All you're conscious of is the relationships, and so, but it does become curved. I'm sorry that the color. I don't want to be critical, but the color is not there. I hadn't seen, these are not my slides. I didn't know the slides, the images before. But another theme, actually in this show, I have three themes. One is the city. I thought they might be in order, but one is the city, one is the landscape, namely Loose Park, the Loose Park pine trees, even more specifically. And the third one is the, well, the city, the park. It's Cambridge Circle, the one that yes, that I was just talking about, the rocks. In the site at Loose Park, I have several, only a few, I've painted there in oil and watercolor. I've painted there for steadily every summer, every year. And the reason I do it, I love the pine trees, but also I can paint later. In other words, I can go into November even, if it doesn't get too, whereas in August, on the deciduous trees, I wouldn't be able to do that. So that's one reason why I painted that particular spot. But this is one of the motifs. The other one, in fact, this one is a late one. These are not in chronological order. This is a late one, and I had painted the three main trees there on a vertical many times, but they had a tree to the right that was about to die, and it did. And they cut it down. It opened up the whole view. So I had, I think I've kind of talked to her about that, the one that controls the park, and the same way on the other side. So, well, first of all, I paint one view in the morning, looking west, and then have lunch, come back, and paint the other view looking east. And as I said, I'm not trying to put anything into it other than that it is teaching me. I am learning to see by observing and painting. And these are the three trees that I said that I could paint before because they're not blocked. But I painted in this show only about 4, I think, verticals, but in all of these I have painted them. This is back to the rocks on Cambridge Circle. Visualize all of these as more color, more saturated, and you will see them. And that's all I can say. But I found that I could paint there, even though it was at an angle, whereas usually I like it just more or less straight on. I found the motif. I found something that was and these paintings were done in the winter time, the late time of the the period. Trucks would be moving in, these big semis, and I couldn't stop and watch, but it was kind of interesting to see how some of them really could back in, and then others had a little struggle, but I didn't get distracted that much about it, but it was always there. And this is actually, if I had to describe it, the color is orange. I didn't think orange, but you'll see, it's really, and I like the motifs, I like the subject. And it is off to the side a little bit, but this is a late one. This would have been done this past summer, but it was done in warmer weather, so. And this also, the one that I said was orange, that was earlier, that was winter time, or colder, and this is later. And this, the other motif that I have for many years, 40 years probably, is Penn Valley by the Scout, Penn Valley Park, looking to the city. So I've seen lots of changes there. And to get a second one, through the 2 years, I just repeated myself. I just did two, in this case, two of the same view. There it is, yeah. Only, let's see. Yeah, this is the last. Gather up some thoughts about questions. I'll keep going here, but again, I thank Bruce and Art and anyone that's planned the show. It just did a fantastic job. That's not all the paintings, but I guess maybe they did that to stop me from talking. Because I can go on. But, yeah, that is it. Please, let's make it a period now of just asking some questions, and then we'll have a chance to see the paintings, I hope. So, yes.
Let me bring the microphone to you so we can record the question too, so everyone can hear.
Early on, I've seen some of your watercolors that are abstract, very abstracted. What brought you from the abstract to the more real?
Yeah. Just very simple, just the evolution of my painting. I just had a show at the Nelson Gallery, which was really about that, from 1952 to present. I've never think of it as a style. It's just where I was at that time, and it evolved. My early paintings were abstract, and I won't go into all the influences, other than that, Mondrian was an influence. Cézanne has always been. Cézanne is still, as a painter, the most influential to me. And when I say influential, it doesn't mean that I am trying to copy his manner or anything like that. It's just, even as a person, he means so much to me. I think he's one of the great artists of all time. But then Mondrian, that happened when I was at the Art Institute, and they had a show called The City, and it was from the Museum of Modern Art. And it had Hopper and Birchfield and all that. And then it had the Mondrian charcoal facade. And all I can say is that had a tremendous impact on my life. It's where I was. It's where I needed abstraction. Everything else didn't seem real to me. That seemed real. So that had a great impact on me. So then in the 50s, I worked in a low-keyed palette, and that was partly due to the instructor that I had, Campanella, at the Art Institute. I was working on my master's, but it also was very natural for me to try to simplify things. And so I worked with ochre, terra rosa, black and white, and the paintings were quite abstract, but I was influenced by just the simplicity, the idea of opposition, vertical, horizontal, basic things. But in contrast to Mondrian, I could never leave the idea of space. So all those the illusion of space. So those early ones, as abstract as they were, my idea was still the illusion of space. So in one sense, I was never abstract that way. Not that I would mind. I don't mind any term. It's just that's where I was, and it was a low key. And then it began to get in. I decided to go to the primary colors. So that painting that you refer to, or that watercolor that they have here, that would be in watercolor would be basically the primary color, and it began to open up, began to get larger in oil, and then one day and of course it was all basically from the landscape. That is, but it was indirect. That's the big distinction. I'm just talking about the evolution. So it was indirect. So I would do a drawing or a couple of drawings maybe on the spot, which were already quite abstract. And then I would come in the studio and do the painting inside. Now in watercolors, they were all done direct, but they were quite abstract. That would be what that mountain was, but it was from direct exposure. And I couldn't, just to have a sheet of paper or a canvas, it doesn't mean anything to me. In other words, what means something is what I'm seeing. And now more than ever. But anyway, so then one day we were in Mexico and came back, and I was happy with my paintings. But I said to myself, why am I painting indirectly? Why not just look out the window and paint what you see? It was one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life, because I didn't bring with that the theory or the ideas. It was just the reaction to what I saw. So that's how it became, going clear back to where I am now. And I've been there, it was 1970, so that's how long it's been that I paint because of what I'm seeing. And I'm learning, and it's a study. I mean, Cézanne didn't just love nature. It was always a study of nature. And study is not a dull thing. I mean, it's exhilarating to learn from what you see. And yes.
When you compose, when you're out in the land and you see what you're going to paint, what happens in your mind when you're composing? Like, do you just look at the scene and say, I want to put that in the middle? Or when you compose, what goes on in your mind? And do you do any pre-sketches, or do you just kind of dive in? And how do you keep your focus once you know, in the way you paint? How do you keep that one focus?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I try to not, through the years of my own changes in development, or no abrupt change, it's all evolved. But I try not to, like this composition, that's one of the great things about Cézanne, incredible thing. It's more realizing the total. In other words, not changing or composing. Composing implying at least parts put together and more formal issues. I've gone through that, but my idea is to look for the spot, and how I know that that 1 foot this way or that way is better. We all have that, I'm sure, but it's just that it does seem right, does seem total. And then, as far as starting, I have the right. I start usually. Well, I always start myself, and others start differently. Cézanne, much of the time, started with very, very light pencil, few marks. But I start with just a light, very light blue, in oil or watercolor. And where I start is I try not to think about it. I just react to what I see, and it's always in the center. In other words, I wouldn't go down here in the corner of the sheet, or it's somewhere in the center. I find something that I can lock into, that I can start, and then it just grows out. So that's the way, in oil or watercolor, that's the way I paint. But, excuse me, did I answer it? Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
When you talked about painting at Loose Park, and you said coming from the west and coming from the east, can you explain more about that? Why is that? That you paint from both
Painting from
directions?
the east and the west. Well, it's the light, it's the sun, the change. In other words, I want the sun to my back. In other words, in landscape, it changes constantly. I mean, you think of it as stable. I've always used the phrase, we don't paint things that move. You can only study things that are still. But yet, in landscape, it's moving constantly. That is, the light is changing. But basically, it's from your back. Because if you painted then the same thing in the afternoon, all of that would be in the dark. All that's in the light now would be in the dark. That's the reason you change from morning to afternoon, or east to west. It's just to get the sun light. And 3 hours is a lot for the constancy, but you learn how to deal with that. In other words, let's say there's a big shadow about 10 o'clock that comes across. In that, you're working not on that spot. Maybe you sometimes you just react to the condition. But in the same way with sunlight, bright or low, the ideal light, as Cézanne said, the ideal light for him was a clear gray. And that is, for me, that's the ideal light for me in painting. But that's the reason, east and west. It's just purely that changes the motif. Now in still life, that's more figure, that's in the studio, that's pretty constant.
I think we can do one more question.
Pardon me?
One more, yes, yeah.
Wilbur, I feel like a timelessness in your paintings that's very calming, and it makes your subjects almost sacred. Is this timelessness one of your objectives, or does it come more from just what you've chosen to paint?
Again, even though it was clear, let her say that again.
Okay. I feel a timelessness in your paintings.
Oh,
That's very calming, but it also seems to make the objects or the subjects sacred, have kind of a sacred quality with the nature, and then the city is almost like it's a forever city, like it's never going to change, even though we know they do change. But I just wondered, is that something that's in your mind when you're painting about making something this pure?
Yeah. Well, that's very nice of you to say that. I try not to think about what would I say, anything other than kind of keep the focus being just a simple study of what I see. In other words, I don't see trees, I don't see faces, I see color. I see this color to that color to that color. And you try to be, I used to tell my students, we have blocks to seeing. That's another thing about the learning. It takes years to learn how to see, even the distance from a subject. You learn to see, I had to learn to see size. When I was doing a geranium painting, and the leaves looked fine, but then suddenly I realized the leaves were larger than what I saw. So when I brought that down and changed the format, I felt more at home. So that was a big learning process. Or the distance to the field of vision, the distance. Like if I'm going to paint your face, I'm up here, but if I'm going to paint the whole body, I move back. And if I go back further, then I'm taking in. So it's very simple things that you learn. So I don't think, other than that, I don't really think about, in fact, one of the things I used to tell students, the inhibitions to painting are many, but probably the most, the biggest inhibition is the painting itself. When the student goes out, sometimes, I'm not saying all students, but they start looking and painting, and then pretty soon they're here painting. They're not looking. And so that's what I mean when I say that becomes an inhibition to seeing. To seeing, it goes constant. You see, you do something, and then you see, you correct. So it's, when I say seeing, I mean constantly correcting being to that subject. Number one, if you're painting with this idea, number one is you have to believe in the subject. In other words, you're not making that over what you see. You're trying to understand what you see. And so that's at least my thought on that.
Okay, well, let's thank Wilbur for his time
Thank you.
and expertise.